Right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Caroline Novo. I'm the Executive Director of the Justice Collaboratory. Really excited about the conversation we're going to have today. This is our fifth and final webinar of the spring semester. So thank you to everyone who's tuned in for our past four webinars. We really appreciate the engagement. As a reminder, every time we do a webinar, we save that as a resource on our website. And you can access those at justicehappenshere.yale.edu. And this one will be available as well. So today, we're going to be hearing from two different teams who are working on projects centered on the topics of procedural justice, moral injury, and how we can, with an understanding of both of those things, really build a path to resilience. Both projects to me are so interesting and are a good fit together because they're doing this hard work of bridging a divide between the understanding of behavioral health and social psychology and the criminal justice system. So first today, we're going to hear about a project. It's sort of a new exploratory piece of work that's happening in four prosecutor offices across the Midwest. And the goal of this project is really to equip criminal justice practitioners with important skills to promote legitimacy within their office, but also focus on their own well-being and all towards building resilience in their careers long term. The second project is also a new research study coming out of Yale that examines how moral injury and trauma affect people who have been incarcerated. Both of these projects do this good work of sort of promoting the shared understanding of the personal experience and the psychology of all the individuals involved, whether that's a practitioner, a survivor, the accused. The basis here is that we can all do better work if we understand each other and we're working together. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with our first presentation. I'm going to introduce our first two presenters, and then I'll introduce Catherine and Neil before they start next. So first up, we have Emily LaGratta and Sarah Schnauzer. Emily is a JD. She is a longtime colleague and friend. I'm so happy that she's going to be sharing this work today. And she's a subject matter expert on the topics of procedural justice and user voice. She works with local and national organizations to design and implement innovative programming, engage end users, and utilize their feedback, all to develop practitioner resources and training that help enhance public trust and confidence in legal institutions. So that's Emily. And then her partner on this great work is Sarah. Sarah is an educator. She's a social worker. She's based in Chicago. She's a certified practitioner of trust-based relational intervention, TBRI. And that's really going to come into a lot of the work that we're going to talk about today. She has worked interdisciplinary with courts and prosecutor offices, often coming in as an expert to help design and implement trauma responsive practices and programming. So Emily and Sarah, please take it away. We're so excited to hear more. Thanks.
All right. Hi, everyone. Happy afternoon. Happy spring. We're really excited to share with you all. Sarah and I just wrapped up our first year of, as Caroline said, this really exploratory project. And this is one of the first times we've presented. Kind of hot off the presses. Essentially, we wanted to look at a mashup, right, of two research-based frameworks. Both have abundant kind of evidence bases, but they're often talked about kind of in silos or in parallel. And so when we had an opportunity to partner with the Joyce Foundation as a funder, we reached out to some prosecutor offices, many of whom we'd worked with before, and said, let's explore these topics together because we actually think this is really responsive to a lot of the problems we're hearing, both from your staff, right? So whether it's prosecutors, victim witness advocates, paralegals, the person who answers the front, the main phone line at a prosecutor's office. They consistently tell us things like the public doesn't understand what we do or why. Victims aren't satisfied if we don't get them the outcome they want. It's either too harsh, it's not harsh enough. There's no time to practice stress reduction, we've heard. So, like any kind of, a little glimmer or a hint at wellness activities, they're like, I've got too much on my plate already. So, we wanted to be responsive to that, and it felt like there was a fit there. As well as what we've heard from other projects that we've worked on, where the community voice was heard directly, right? Their perspectives of prosecutors are often that they seem too lenient, they seem too harsh, they treat people coming through like trash, or there's kind of a lack of dignity. And we've heard that from, the accused as well as victims, witnesses, family members in terms of critiques, right? These are among good things being said as well, but there's a lot of feeling like there's energy going in, resources going in, and lots of dissatisfaction coming out, really on kind of both sides or all sides from professionals and the public. And so we wanted to see whether these two frameworks together might actually do something really powerful, like have this cumulative effect to see if we can kind of align professionals' efforts and expectations with the public's. And it seemed like there were kind of um, good indicators that there could be a lot of strength here. So, for those who are either, new to procedural justice or trauma responsive practices or both, the idea is that when legal authority uses procedural justice practices, they promote legitimacy, right? They promote trust in government, cooperation with government. It helps those entities to be more effective. In addition to that kind of legitimacy as its own goal. Similarly, trauma responsive practices, we know that when those are used in various settings, including courts, we produce resilience, right? The capacity to stay present, whether you're a litigant, witness, victim, the accused going through court, but even the professionals working in those spaces. So again, our sort of hypothesis was that if we actually are doing both of those things at the same time, that whole is going to be greater than the sum of the parts, that they actually can kind of together make prosecutors and prosecution staff more effective. Um, and are kind of at a very basic level, we noticed too that if you just even look at the kind of elements of each framework, there's overlap. So we'll talk a little bit about this more, but essentially, we have these evidence-based elements of procedural justice in green here. People want to be respected. They want to see legal authority as neutral and unbiased. They want to have a voice in the process. And they want to see that the kind of motivating factors for those authority are trustworthy. We see many of those show up in those other elements below in blue as trauma responsive practices, empowerment, voice, choice, trustworthiness, transparency, and safety. So we knew that there would be some very direct overlaps in terms of applications. But we also suspected that it actually might help professionals to be more receptive to one or the other or both, as we got kind of deeper involved. So that was our somewhat ambitious mission starting out. We were very lucky to have 4 prosecutors' offices. All 4 that we asked agreed to work with us. And so we had about 30 professionals across those 4 opposite offices, a mix, mostly prosecutors, lawyers, but a good group of victim witness specialists as well. We had a paralegal, we had a supervising administrative assistant. And notably, many of those people had significant amounts of experience, right? So we had some people with less than 5 years, but a lot with at least 5 years and almost half with 10 years. And so these were not spring chickens, right? These were folks who were, lots of experience, lots of entrenchment in the culture that we were, kind of bumping up against as well. And many of them actually have supervisory roles as well. So we were intrigued by how that dimension of this could really play out too in terms of scaling some of the benefits that played out. So I'm going to tell you just quickly kind of a rough timeline of what we did, and then we want to show you some examples. I'm going to turn the mic over to Sarah to help us give you some examples of the content that we worked with them on. Um, so we got them to commit to just about 9 months, kind of start to end of engagement with us. So it started out with a questionnaire that allowed us to do a post questionnaire in the end in terms of their knowledge, their attitudes, their behaviors on these topics. We brought everyone at each site together for a half-day retreat, which was really pivotal. We wanted to practice what we preach, meaning that we wanted to meet them where they were. We wanted to listen. We wanted to document the good practices they were already using. We wanted to name what our motives were. And we wanted to start to share some of this resilience work, which again, Sarah's going to touch on. And then we essentially had about 6 months that was all remote engagement. And we had to be really creative here because all of these people, as we kind of identified early, were really busy, pretty stressed, and didn't have a whole lot of room to fit in things. And for many prosecutors, they could just disappear on trial for weeks at a time. So we did things like watch parties. We had asynchronous engagements that just showed up in their inbox and they could kind of click through something, share their perspectives, ask questions. We had little mini sessions that they could just drop into for 30 minutes. And we did lots of kind of creative follow-up, one-on-ones to catch people up. And more, which we'll show you here in a minute. So just wanted to give a bit of a landscape of the kind of envelope we had in terms of dosing folks with this. I'll turn it to Sarah.
Thanks, Emily. So these are some images that our participants saw throughout our time together. And one foundational premise of this project is that stress directly shapes professional interactions and decision-making within legal systems. So we introduce participants to basic neuroscience related to how our bodies respond to threats, including how how chronic stress exposure can impact attention. It can increase reactivity, and it can reduce our access to flexible and reflective and connected relational thinking. So we explored the concepts of hyperarousal and hypoarousal, as you can see in this image on the right, and our window of tolerance, which is the space we can inhabit when we're feeling good and the stress doesn't impact us too much. So we looked at this particularly in courtroom and prosecutorial environments, which are, of course, characterized by high emotional intensity, urgency, and repeated exposure to trauma narratives. So we discussed how they could adapt to chronic stress by emotionally distancing or shutting down or numbing themselves out in order to survive, to continue functioning. And in the short term, this is our body's wisdom to try to help us. And they can be protective, but over time, they can be detrimental to our well-being, our relationships, the ability to remain fully present with other people, to access joy. So if we stay in that state of chronic stress, it can really impact our lives. So part of this work involved helping participants reconnect with bodily awareness. So just becoming more aware of the messages that their body was giving them. So instead of ignoring stress responses, we encourage participants to notice the messages that their bodies were communicating, whether that's tension or exhaustion or irritability or shutdown or overwhelm, whatever it may be, and then take those messages and learn how to interpret them so that we can respond appropriately with strategies that support regulation and coming back into that window of tolerance rather than chronically suppressing the feeling or disengaging. So we frame this not just simply as wellness work, but as professional competency connected to the ability to maintain capacity for consistent delivery of procedural justice practices. So we can look on the next slide. So throughout our pilot, we integrated really brief evidence-based regulation practices designed specifically for their high-demand work environments. So these practices were intentionally short, pragmatic, and adaptable to courtroom settings. So as you can see, we had grounding techniques, somatic techniques, and breath work, mindfulness exercises. We did body scans, visual orienting, diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle release, structured grounding exercises, and we called this dosing. So we did a little bit at a time so that we could build trust, as a lot of this was often new to the folks that we work with. So some of these practices were designed for in-the-moment stress during court proceedings or difficult interactions, and others focused on helping them transition out of work, so leaving the work at work before returning home. And then others were intended for use even later whenever the stress response continued, even after the workday had ended. And so we were trying to really frame mindfulness in a very concrete way. So not as, having a Zen moment or clearing your mind or escaping the stress, but as strengthening awareness of the thoughts, the emotions, the bodily responses, in ways that allow for more intentional choice. So instead of being reactive, we are empowered with the choice of response. And that gives us greater flexibility under pressure. So our emphasis isn't asking professionals to disengage from their difficult and very meaningful and important work, but rather on strengthening their capacity to remain present, to remain regulated and relationally connected during challenging interactions.
Thanks. And you'll notice, or I guess I wanted to highlight, we were really deliberate with what words we chose to use to describe these. So even the term resilience, so it was called the Legitimacy and Resilience Project. We were using trauma responsive practices, but we actually didn't hit that head on exactly. And our hope was that it would allow us to do, as Sarah said, to kind of help these professionals to really experience the value of these practices for themselves, to like kind of maintain full access to their skill set. But yes, show that as a bridge to these are similar practices and strategies you can use to help a witness to stay present, right? Or to stay grounded. And so just wanted to flag that in terms of just even word choice. So we're showing here just a screenshot of a tool that we used. Again, one of our other kind of like format strategies of this project. Working with busy professionals, we created an online community where they could go to see the calendar of events. They could watch, videos that they had missed. Many of them were very tiny. So like you'll see there was a lunchtime meditation that we recorded. It was under 8 minutes. So we wanted things that really fit practically into their workflow and things that they could return to. So that was kind of what I think alongside the like substantive part of the kind of experiment, we were also trying to be creative about strategies we were using. And much of it, I did too, just want to underscore, we really wanted to lean into the brain science behind the resilience work, right? And some of that is we were curious whether there would be some cultural resistance, right? Sarah said, the sort of Zen moments, for the non-yogis in our participant group, right? That this is brain science, right? This is how human brains respond to, perceptions of threats and risk, et cetera. And that really was a helpful framing for us to then connect these two topics. So, for example, one of the very small but mighty practices that we often recommend in procedural justice work and in resilience work is when you are first encountering someone, you greet them and you make eye contact, right? Seems easy enough. Doesn't happen all that time in criminal court or in criminal court settings. And so we wanted to show the brain science behind the value of that, right? It's not a pleasantry alone. So This is a screenshot from one of those remote engagements we did. So it kind of gives them a bit of content. And then we asked them, would you commit to trying this, right? Kind of name your commitment for this. And we tracked that over time, and encouraged people, through reminders to help with that kind of practice implementation as well as just kind of the knowledge growth.
So another thing that we hit on throughout our time involved helping participants to reconnect with and to articulate their underlying values behind their work. Procedural justice really emphasizes the importance of demonstrating trustworthy motives, and we found that many professionals benefited from kind of a structured reflection around what justice means to them personally and professionally. So we had them engage with these prompts. I value, I prioritize blank alongside blank. I care about this. It's important to me that this is happening or this is seen. And this is a way of really reconnecting daily practice to that intrinsic motivation and professional identity. And we also discussed the wellness value or the resilience value of naming your intentions and values, particularly in this profession that involves chronic stress and ambiguity and morally complex decision making. So when people lose touch with why they entered the work in the first place or what's really foundationally motivating for them, it starts to become easier to operate on autopilot, or become emotionally detached or default into purely reactive patterns. And again, these are good-hearted people, right, who are doing their best to survive that chronic stress. But we learned that even pausing long enough to name what matters to us can interrupt that autopilot stress reaction and help us reconnect more with the reflective part of our brain responsible for judgment, perspective taking, and intentional decision making. So this process also created opportunities for participants to think a bit more intentionally about how their communication styles either reinforce or undermine perceptions of legitimacy and fairness. So you can see here in our graph, it's a bit small, but how our participants were defining justice in their own words. And then in our next slide, we name this kind of stating the value red string motivation. So you might also know this as a mantra, but we use red string motivations. So this was just a short, grounding, values-based reminder. And they were intended to help our participants, again, reconnect to their purpose and maintain perspective during stressful moments. So it's almost like a positive trigger, if you will. So they function almost like a cognitive anchor. So in high pressure situations, it's easy to become task focused or reactive. But again, these short phrases sort of interrupt that, bring them back to the professional that they want to be, bring them back to a reminder of why this is important, how intentional interactions can change things, can shift the environment, the energy in the environment. And while this is relatively simple, our participants often describe these reminders as helping them to stay more intentional, to stay relationally aware and connected to the reasons why they're doing the work. So these quotes that you see here are from our participants. So mine needs to be where my feet are. Again, there's our folks have huge caseloads. They're very busy. There's always something to do next. And so remembering I'm someone's only beacon in an unkind and confusing situation, or this is one of 500 cases for me, but this is everything to them, or I value fairness alongside accountability. And so here's another example of a tool that we offer to our participants. And we just encourage them to develop a individualized regulation plan based on their own stress patterns and warning signs. So this helped them to identify when they were leaving that window of tolerance, what are their signs and symptoms that they're entering into a heightened stress response. And if we can identify when we're moving in that direction, then it empowers us again with choice to be able to respond instead of react. So they then identified, those signs and symptoms and then practical interventions that could realistically be used within the flow of their workday. So that might just be a posture shift or a grounding technique or a different way of breathing, certain movements, sensory resets. And then another tool that we use here is just translating those procedural justice practices into something concrete. Like Emily said, we might think, I'm having a respectful interaction, or I am respectful, or I am giving voice. But if we can identify these concrete strategies and intentionally check them off, or if I'm thinking about a particular case or preparing for something, I'm able to look at this sheet and say, okay, these are the things that I'm going to do to incorporate these procedural justice practices. Okay, no, we're short.
All right. Yes, I'm aware that we're at time. So we have some results for you, but maybe we can just highlight those in the end. We'll pass the mic over to our or to Caroline to introduce our co-panelists. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks
You
so
are.
much. I really appreciate it. And we'll just switch the screen share real quick while I introduce everyone. All right, so up next, we really should have just titled this webinar Caroline's Favorite People because I just collected everyone who I think is brilliant and doing such wonderful work. So two other friends and colleagues here. So we have Neil Gallagher is a rising 3L at UC Berkeley School of Law. Where he serves as associate editor of the California Law Review and is a member of the Berkeley Journal of Criminal Law. At Berkeley Law, he focuses on legal issues affecting justice-impacted and incarcerated populations. He co-leads the Legal Obstacles Veterans Encounter Pro Bono Service Project and contributes to the Post-Conviction Advocacy Project and the Veterans Justice Commission. He is not busy at all. And next up, we have wonderful Catherine Thomas, who is a licensed psychologist and attorney. She works as a researcher at the Sage Center for Health and Justice, which is at the Yale School of Medicine. She has provided mental health treatment to justice-involved people in a variety of settings, including a forensic hospital, drug diversion programs, and a public defender office. Her research focuses on developing evidence-based treatments that address moral injury and post-traumatic stress in people with histories of incarceration. Catherine and Neil, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Caroline, and very excited to be here with you all and to present with Neil on a project that we've been working on together for a few years now, focused on moral injury in people with histories of incarceration. We know that incarcerated people have much higher rates of mental health disorders than the general population, and we think that's a bi-directional relationship where people with mental health and substance use disorders are more likely to be arrested, and incarceration causes psychological distress and exacerbates underlying or pre-existing mental health concerns. And we're particularly interested in this project on PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And you can see in the graphic here that people in state prisons have twice as high of a rate of PTSD than the general US adult population. And part of that is because of the high rates of trauma that people are exposed to during incarceration. And we see that there's high rates of physical violence, sexual violence, abuse, and exposure to punitive policies, things like solitary confinement and strip searches. And we know that incarcerated people are directly exposed to these traumas, but also vicariously exposed to them by witnessing the trauma of other people who are incarcerated or of staff. And I think one statistic that really just highlights how prevalent experiences of trauma are is that incarcerated men are 18 times more likely to be assaulted than the general population. And we know from the research that there's a real lack of evidence-based mental health treatment focused on the reentry period. Existing mental health treatment tends to focus primarily on substance use and trying to achieve sobriety. And there's really a lack of evidence-based PTSD treatments in particular. Most of the existing studies on PTSD treatments tend to focus on recidivism as the outcome, but don't tend to study whether the treatments actually work, whether they lead to reductions in PTSD symptoms. And there are currently no evidence-based PTSD treatments that address the unique experiences of incarceration. Of the existing PTSD treatments for the general population, we see that they tend to focus on addressing traumatic events involving fear conditioning, which is really kind of the physiological response to a life or death traumatic event. So, one example might be a military service member witnessing the death of a friend during combat. And there's two gold standard PTSD treatments that were developed in the VA system and used in a variety of different populations. One being cognitive processing therapy or CPT, which really focuses on the cognitive underlying process in PTSD. So it involves identifying and challenging unhelpful thoughts and beliefs that arise after a traumatic event. So one example might be someone that believes that they can't trust anyone as a result of their trauma. The other evidence-based treatment is called prolonged exposure therapy, and it involves more focus on the memory or the traumatic memories themselves. So it involves gradually confronting trauma-related memories to reduce fear and avoidance behaviors and hopefully address those kind of more physiological symptoms of trauma. But we've seen through clinical work and research that these treatments are really not effective for treating more existential traumas, things that shatter our world beliefs and our general faith in other people and humanity. Which brings us to this idea of moral injury. One definition of moral injury is that it's perpetrating or witnessing acts of transgression that violate deeply held moral beliefs and expectations, which I think is just sort of a wordy way of seeing or doing something that goes against our feeling of right and wrong. I mean, there's three different types of moral injury. There's acts of commission, so someone actually doing something themselves that goes against their values. Acts of omission, so failing to act in a situation in a way that goes against one's values, and betrayal. And this can be individual level betrayal, like betrayal from a friend or a family member, or institutional betrayal, so feeling like an institution that someone's part of is failing them in some way. And just like the other PTSD treatments we just discussed, a moral injury has primarily been studied in combat veterans. And some examples were, say, a veteran being forced to engage in violence during combat and then returning home and kind of grappling with the moral consequences of that. Another example might be witnessing violence towards innocent bystanders during war, or feeling betrayed by leadership, an example of institutional betrayal. And research has shown that moral injury raises the risk of developing a lot of different negative mental health outcomes, ranging from PTSD, depression, suicidal thinking, and suicidal behaviors, as well as substance abuse. And in terms of the types of moral injury we just discussed, those tend to be focused on the types of exposure, the types of moral injurious events. But there's also research looking at the outcome or symptoms of moral injury. So when someone's exposed to those events, what are the types of symptoms that they may develop? And some examples of these symptoms include things like self-destructive impulses, really strong feelings of guilt or shame or self-blame, feelings of betrayal, a loss of trust in other people, a lack of purpose, and then mental health symptoms like anxiety or depression. For sake of time, I'll just briefly note the kind of overlap between moral injury and PTSD. PTSD is going to be a mental health diagnosis according to the DSM-5, and it tends to involve those life or death situations, either witnessing them or experiencing them firsthand. But it tends to be more strongly associated with the emotions that were present during the event, so primarily that feeling of fear. Whereas moral injury is not a formal diagnosis in the DSM-5. It tends to involve an event that raises those moral questions that we discussed. And it's more strongly associated with emotions that develop after the event. So something like guilt or shame as a result of one's actions or failure to act. But there's a lot of overlapping symptoms between the two. And we know that experiences of moral injury increase one's risk of developing PTSD.
So as far as that goes for incarceration, there's like various different ways it can come about. There's a lot of times it's from the crime itself, witnessing different acts while incarcerated, whether it be sexual or physical assaults, abuse by the correctional officers, or feeling forced to commit a violent act to stay safe. Prior to this study, there was really only one that we found, and that was really only focused on people with former life sentences in California. they actually arrived at a lot of the similar data that we did, which was kind of interesting. But that study really didn't look to the specific experiences in prison that caused the moral injury. And just based on my own incarceration, the kind of things you do see is like, well, for me personally, was not being able to really like help people. When you see something, there's not a lot you can do, and that's something that stayed with me. And you also just there's a lot of things where it kind of goes, you kind of have to adapt to things that might have violated beliefs you once held. So there's a lot of things that just kind of change over time, and it's just yeah. So the current study, we kind of, I guess you would say, like formed it to look like prior to incarceration, during, and after. And we want to understand the relationship between the actual exposure to the moral injury and then the mental health outcomes. And what we were wanting to do is adapt the treatments that they have done, what they have for the veterans, and see if we can adapt it to the incarcerated populations. Because right now, really, the treatments are focused on like the military culture, and there's nothing really for the incarcerated populations. Currently, we have just under 140 people who have done the survey, and we're conducting individual interviews with people who committed the or who filled out the survey and were willing to do so. And yeah, so that's where we're at with that. These are the current states we have. There's certain states have filled out more just because we have better connections in them, like California for one. We have a group called Underground Scholars at Berkeley, and they filled out a ton, which is great. I was from Florida, so there's a lot of data from there. Catherine has a lot of connections in Connecticut, so but it's pretty vast. So if you know anyone in the states, the blue is the states we haven't had anyone. If anyone listening has any connections, please let us know. But yeah, so it's a lot more geographically diverse than the previous study that we found. So we're excited for that. And what's interesting is even across the states, they're still reporting a lot of the similar data than just the California one. That was the previous study, which is interesting. These are the kind of the results we're getting. Some of the data might be a bit skewed. We didn't ask what their, like, for example, for their education, we didn't ask what it was prior to incarceration, just what their current is. And again, kind of, so the underground scholar program, they're all currently like in some sort of educational program at Berkeley, so that might kind of throw it off. That might also affect, like their employment, because if they're in school, they're not employed. So that's just something to kind of be aware of there. But it is interesting. A lot of the data is very correlated to the previous studies, so that's something that really hasn't changed. And this is it's kind of like some bullets of the overall thing. One thing that's kind of interesting is like the range of the age of the first incarceration, youngest being 11, oldest 68. That kind of stood out to me. Um, the another thing going forward we might kind of adjust is like I guess more strictly defining the number of times incarcerated, because if say you bond out, and then you agree to a plea deal, does that count as two times? Is it like if you spend a night in the drunk tank, is that a form of incarceration? We didn't really strictly define that, so that might have like skewed some data. So I guess going forward or future studies, we might, I guess, more strictly define it. But this is kind of what we found so far.
And now wanted to shift into some of the results focused on the moral injury exposure itself. I mean, we found incredibly high rates of exposure to moral injurious events. About 97% of our participants reported experiencing some type of moral injury. And like Neil said, we focused on moral injury before, during, and after incarceration because we thought it'd be important to take that sort of lifespan approach and think about how experiences of moral injury may compound upon oneself. And so, in terms of the prevalence rates, we found that moral injury before incarceration was the most prevalent. About 97% of participants described some sort of moral injury before incarceration, and we'll describe the specific types of experiences that participants described. In terms of moral injury during incarceration, we also saw a really high rate of moral injury exposure, about 83% of participants. And about 44% of participants described moral injury after incarceration as well. In terms of the types of moral injury before incarceration, we spent some time trying to think through how to best capture this data, given that there aren't a lot of measures that are already designed to ask about this specific type of moral injury. So we came up with kind of a checklist of different types of moral injury that we thought people might endorse prior to their incarceration. We found that the most common types of moral injury were actually experiences during childhood, specifically being betrayed by other people as a child. About 66% of participants reported that type of moral injury. And we also found pretty high rates of moral injury related to substance use. So people doing things or witnessing things while under the influence of substances or being betrayed by others while under the influence. The most common being actually that personal commission. So someone doing something that went against their sense of right or wrong. And then finally, we saw a lot of participants reporting moral injury related to the crime they committed itself. About 60% of participants described moral injury while committing a crime, about 45% while being betrayed by others while committing a crime, and about 42% witnessed a crime and felt a sense of moral injury from that. And then finally, we asked about moral injury related to membership in a gang or any sort of organization, and found that about a fifth of participants described this form of moral injury, whether it be being betrayed by other people, witnessing something, or doing something themselves in that context. We also wanted to share a few quotes that are examples from participants. We had some open-ended survey questions that we included to see if participants may want to describe their experiences. And we were really pleasantly surprised with how rich the data was. And we're currently in the process of analyzing that data.
Yeah, some of the results we got could probably be a presentation on its own. But would it be helpful if I read it, or should we just let it go across the screen? What do you think?
Sure, I think it'd be helpful to read it if you feel comfortable.
Yeah. While living a life of or lives that revolve around drugs or gangs, you are exposed to things, witness things, or commit actions you probably wouldn't have had anything to do with had you not lived or that life or lives. I know I've lived at times double, triple, or even quadruple lives to the point where you don't know which way is up when yesterday ended or tomorrow starts. I saw a lot growing up with officers selling drugs, organizing crime to the point I thought this was all part of life. They just had a badge to play, and we didn't. As a drug addict, I robbed and stole many times. I also witnessed a lot of community violence, but I moved with the mentality that the one best minded their business. Crimes that I committed while using drugs went against my moral code, but when I attempted to leave the group I was running with, I was threatened in several ways.
In terms of types of moral injury that participants described during incarceration, we asked across those three categories, whether they did something, witnessed something, or were betrayed by other people. We found that the most common example of moral injury was witnessing something that went against someone's moral codes or values. About 73% of participants described this form of moral injury. And we also saw a high rate of betrayal during incarceration. About 43.5% of participants reported this type of moral injury, and about 27% reported doing something that went against their moral code or value. Also wanted to share a few types of moral injury during incarceration in terms of quotes from participants.
Over the course of 13 years, I witnessed and lived inside of a society devoid of any moral code or compass. Officers frequently abused power on those that could not protect themselves. They also hid information, falsified reports, and covered abuse of each other to audit teams and superior staff. Watching someone get brutally attacked and murdered. I was involved in a physical altercation with another incarcerated person. He kept pushing me, and I finally had to do something to save face.
And then finally, in terms of moral injury exposure after incarceration, we saw that this wasn't as common as before and during incarceration, but still found pretty high rates of moral injury exposure. About 27% of participants described being betrayed by someone they thought they trusted after returning home. About 14% witnessed something that went against their moral code or values, and about 8.7% did something that went against their moral code or values after returning home. And just a few quotes that participants gave about moral injury exposure after incarceration.
I did the time for someone I trusted, and they no longer are my friend, and killed one of my closest friends. Coworkers have released the details of my arrest to other coworkers, which has had me deal with death threats, plots to cause harm, and forced to leave places of employment. My family turned their backs on me. It has been 25 years since my release from incarceration. Society and life are filled with betrayal. I have had trust broken by friends, family, spouse, law enforcement, clergy, neighbors, mental health staff, and of course, parole officers and police officers. We come home and are told this myth, this great lie. We are told that if we do the right thing, good things will happen. Yet I watch so many of my family members and friends struggle to make it after incarceration.
Also wanted to highlight some of the initial findings we've had. We've started looking at the quantitative data, trying to understand the relationship between moral injury exposure and mental health outcomes, as well as other variables that may help to explain that relationship. So things like institutional betrayal, experiences of dehumanization. We have a really rich data set, and we're in the process of analyzing some of those kind of statistical models to better understand those relationships. But wanted to just present some preliminary findings looking at correlations between moral injury exposure and some of our mental health outcomes. And we found the strongest correlation was with anxiety, interestingly, because in prior research, that wasn't typically the strongest correlation. And in some studies, it wasn't actually correlated at all. But we also saw, similar to prior existing research, that there's a strong correlation between moral injury and PTSD, as well as moral injury and depression. Surprisingly, we didn't find a significant correlation with substance use, which also kind of goes against some of the prior research where they did find that strong relationship. Also wanted to just present briefly on the severity of moral injury distress that participants reported. So this is looking more at the outcome of moral injury, some of those symptoms that we discussed earlier, rather than the moral injury exposure itself, the events. I mean, we saw a really high rate of moral injury distress, the most common being a mild form of distress, according to the validated scale we used. About 48% of participants fell within that mild category. About a fifth or about a quarter of participants fell within the moderate category, and about 3% within the severe category. So we were pretty surprised at how high this number was, that about 78% of participants had some sort of clinically meaningful moral injury distress as a result of that high rate of moral injury exposure.
For the results of the study, pretty much the moral injury exposure was common across the lifespan of the participants. Prior to their incarceration, it was most common from child abuse, their criminal behavior, and substance abuse. During incarceration, the moral injury that they reported was most common from witnessing something immoral. And after release, the participants often reported it was like the stigma, betrayal, and the barriers they faced is resulting in their moral injury, and it's often correlated with PTSD, depression, anxiety, and that's yeah. Sorry.
And in terms of next steps on the project, we're currently conducting qualitative interviews, as Neil mentioned earlier. So we're trying to conduct these really in-depth interviews to understand moral injury across the lifespan, before, during, and after incarceration, with the goal of really developing a conceptual framework of types of moral injury exposure that are common related to incarceration. And we're hoping to use that framework to guide the adaptation of a therapy manual originally designed to treat moral injury in veterans. This manual is called Trauma-Informed Guilt Reduction Therapy, and it's a 6-session sort of manualized treatment that's been applied to quite a few different populations, but not yet applied to people with justice involvement. And it really focuses on the idea of adaptive versus maladaptive guilt and shame, that there may be some type of guilt and shame that helps us kind of understand our values, but also types of guilt and shame that are kind of overwhelming and may keep someone from being able to live their life. And they found that this treatment has been a really effective treatment for PTSD in veterans. They did a recent clinical trial where they found about 2/3 of veterans had meaningful reductions in PTSD symptoms after just 6 sessions of this therapy. And I'll go ahead and wrap up there, but happy to answer any questions that y'all have.
Yes, thank you so much. A little round of applause for everyone. Appreciate you guys. I will flag we've had a few questions come in through the Q&A, and I encourage all of our attendees to go ahead and submit those questions. I want to make sure we get to audience questions. So I'm going to first start, Catherine and Neil, you're presenting, but if you check, you have a couple of questions in the Q&A for you to check out there, and I'll read them aloud. But Emily and Sarah, let's go to you because I thought there was a great question that came through where someone was sort of asking this question of maybe being a little surprised that people working in this industry did not really have some basics already to help them self-regulate and coping. So if you could just talk a little bit about your experience with that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much to the person who submitted that and shared a little bit of their own personal context and experience with this. And so um, I'm quite sure that in these few minutes we will can't give a very satisfying answer, but I guess what it sparked for me, I love your phrase of kind of personal responsibility. I think that's a concept tied to these resilience practices that I don't see yet kind of culturally. I was a public defender at the very beginning of my career. And the resilience strategy was like to go to the bar that's closest to the courthouse and just sort of drink the pain away. That was sort of basically in the employee manual. So I guess I just wanted to note that, yeah, I think our project was, I think we were deliberately very gentle and slow because we knew that there were strong cultural headwinds here, like even among folks who were opting in. Most law schools aren't teaching these things, right? Lawyers are coming out practicing without these skills, plus this sort of maybe cultural pressure that may actually be the opposite, right? So I recently presented to the incoming class of prosecutors at a major prosecutor's office. There must have been, 75 bright young minds in the room. And one of the presenters, with no warning, just launched right into the gritty details of this heinous sexual assault case. Um, and made some compelling legal point and then just sort of wrapped it up and passed the mic back to me. And and to me, it was just such a poignant example of that trauma is so normalized in these spaces, in the offices, in courtrooms. And so there's almost this sense that like if you can't just have that roll right off you, then you're in the wrong profession. And so we're trying to again just be really deliberate in how we meet folks in that setting. And yes, in the meantime, it has really horrifying impacts on people being served, right? Including victims, and the accused and family members, all of them. So I'm sure Sarah has thoughts to add on this.
Yeah, so one of our findings was that 95% of our participants after the program reported strengthening trauma responsive practices in relation to themselves. And I think a lot of times when we get trained on trauma responsive practices, it's toward the people that we're working with. But we found that they didn't necessarily know those basics of how to regulate themselves or the signs that they were becoming dysregulated. And we found that when they were able to experience that dysregulation to regulation within themselves, it was much easier to build that bridge of empathy to the people that they were working with. And so I wish this feels like the basic manual that we should all receive or get taught about how our body works and what we can do about it. But by providing those experiences and allowing them to really feel what that's like to go from dysregulation to regulation, seemed to help them spot that in the people that they were working with.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions that are coming in that are overlapping nicely, sort of the intersection here of moral injury and perceptions of a fair trial. as well as sort of procedural justice in that. So I'm gonna start, Catherine and Neil, I'd love you to tackle this one, but it says, I'm curious, would you ever conceptualize moral injury as sparking from the legal system itself? Many pro se litigants file cases alleging due process and civil rights violations, but it's clear that underlying their legal claims are heartfelt moral claims that go to the issues of lack of respect for human dignity of defendants in the system. So there's that question, and sort of along the same line, someone else said, how do you think moral injury is sort of interacting with this like right to a fair trial?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for those questions. I think they're incredibly thoughtful, and I completely agree with both of them that I do think the experience and kind of exposure to the legal system can often be its own form of trauma or moral injury. And I think we've seen that reflected some in the qualitative data, that participants have described feeling like they weren't respected by people within the legal system, whether it be, police officers, prosecutors, sort of anyone who's a legal actor in the legal process itself, and how that was a form of moral injury and really affected the way they could trust other people and the way that they viewed humanity and just their ability to sort of form relationships moving forward. And I'm hoping that that will be something we can continue to explore in the qualitative interviews as well.
Catherine, didn't we add a question or two in there about if if they went to trial, if it was covered, if their case was covered in the media? I
Yes, we
believe
did,
yeah,
which
and
I think
then
really ties into that well.
yeah, so it's kind of going into if it's like if they believe they got a fair trial, depending on like the news coverage it received, things like that. If they had to get a different venue, then yeah. And I guess for like the pro se litigant claims, I guess part of that might be just how narrowly defined, like like those claims have to fit in a very narrow bucket to actually go anywhere, and that might be a different issue on itself. It's not really, I don't know, that may be more of like a procedural a process issue. And that's not. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know. It might be that's for me. That's hard to answer. I don't know if you have thoughts to that.
And I think it really shows that overlap between procedural justice and moral injury, that I really do think the two constructs are really related and I think could be a really important thing to study moving forward. Kind of that overlap, both for people who are incarcerated, but also other legal actors within the system.
Yeah, I see our attendees are walking over the bridge that we've built for them, which is great. And I just want to flag, someone just threw it in a message in there that they'd love any links you can share. So if any of you have websites, or if you want to throw those in the chat, or if I know Emily shared her email address, but if anyone's willing to share their contact information, please go ahead and put that in the chat for our attendees. One last question maybe about moral injury here is that someone says, I have a theory it's all relational in some capacity, both the harm and the healing, which is such a good intersection between what Sarah and Emily were talking about. How much relational trauma have you seen within this population?
Oh, I completely agree with that as well, that I do think the relational piece seems to be the most impactful. And I thought that was a really interesting finding from our survey results, that the most commonly reported type of moral injury during incarceration was not actually something that happened directly to the participants, but what they witnessed in other people, and that feeling of kind of sadness or guilt about not intervening when they witnessed something that went against their values, which I think really highlights how it's the relational component that's the most kind of harmful or the most impactful long term, not necessarily just the experience of the trauma or the moral injury itself. Which I think also just really highlights the importance of kind of expanding the way we think about trauma and PTSD and thinking more about these exposures to things that may not be life or death situations, but may actually have just as strong of an impact, that are more relational in nature.
Absolutely. I think we maybe have time for maybe one more question, which is Emily, Sarah, I'd love for you if you could share any sort of aha or breakthrough moments that you saw the people participating in the project experience.
Sarah, go for it. I know we have more than 2 minutes prepared on this
Yeah,
course.
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
okay.
So one of our victim witness advocates was working with a victim who was going to give testimony and was having what she recognized to be a trauma response to being in the courtroom and speaking. And so she was able to take one of the practices that we had taught in our time together, which is using your senses to ground to the present moment. And she adapted that in the moment. She said, "Hey, this might seem a little silly, but just follow my lead. What are 5 things you can see in the room right now? 4 things you can touch?" And after she did that process with the victim, they were able to go back up and give their testimony, which was really important to the case and to them. So that was on one of our follow-up calls, and it was really awesome to see someone take what they had learned and experienced for themselves, and then not just spit it back out verbatim, but adapt it and use their own words, their own way to communicate that in a meaningful way that allowed for that victim to be resilient in that moment.
Wonderful. What a beautiful example of applying all of this theory and evidence to a real world situation, which is what we really strive to amplify here at the Collaboratory. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate all of the attendees' times, our panelists. I went ahead and put the link to our website in the chat. Again, this will be available as a living resource on the website. It gives about a week to upload it. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day and a great Memorial Day weekend. I'm gonna go ahead and close this out. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.